The gunshot echoed across the open plains as Grace Whitley ran for her life, the burning brand on her shoulder still searing with pain beneath her torn dress. Montana Territory, 1877, was unforgiving to women without protection, and Grace had learned this truth in the cruelest way imaginable. The dark silhouettes of her pursuers dotted the horizon behind her. 3 years she'd endured captivity at the hands of the Blackwood brothers, who ran their ranch with an iron fist and treated their workers, especially the women they claimed to own, worse than their livestock. The crude B branded on her right shoulder marked her as Blackwood property, a mark she'd carry to her grave. Grace's lungs burned as she pushed forward through the tall prairie grass. Her escape had been months in the planning but mere minutes in execution. A carelessly placed key, a distracted guard, and suddenly freedom had been within her grasp. Now, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the pale moon lighting her way, she ran toward the only hope she had, the distant lights of Silverwood, a mining town she'd overheard the brothers mention. Another gunshot cracked the night air, closer this time. Grace stumbled, her bare feet bloody from the rocky terrain. She wouldn't make it to town, not with them so close behind. Desperation drove her toward a cluster of boulders, the only shelter visible in the moonlit landscape. As she ducked behind the largest rock, her breath coming in ragged gasps, she heard the approaching horses. The Blackwoods never gave up what they considered theirs. She closed her eyes, pressing herself against the cold stone, praying for a miracle she didn't believe would come. "You there?" Behind the rocks, the voice was unfamiliar, not one of the Blackwoods. "Stay down." More gunshots erupted, but they weren't aimed at her. Grace heard shouts of surprise, then anger, then pain. The thundering of hooves grew distant, retreating back the way they'd come. Silence fell across the prairie, broken only by the soft nickering of a horse nearby. Grace remained frozen, unsure if she'd traded one danger for another. "Madam," the voice was closer now, gentle but firm. "They're gone. You can come out. I won't hurt you." Slowly, Grace peered around the edge of the boulder. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, his horse grazing calmly behind him. In one hand he held a Winchester rifle, still smoking from recent use. "Name's Kieran Dawson," he said, keeping his distance. "I don't mean you any harm." Grace stepped out cautiously, her legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. "How do I know that?" The man Kieran carefully lowered his rifle and held up his hands. "Fair question. I'm just a rancher passing through. Saw those men chasing you, and figured no decent men chase a woman like that unless they mean her harm." A cloud shifted, and moonlight illuminated his features. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His eyes, though they were kind in a way Grace had forgotten existed. "They'll be back," she whispered, glancing nervously in the direction the Blackwoods had fled. "They don't give up what they think belongs to them." Kieran's jaw tightened. "No one owns people in this territory, madam." "Not anymore." Grace laughed bitterly, pulling aside the torn fabric of her dress to reveal the ugly brand on her shoulder. "Tell that to the Blackwoods." In the moonlight, she watched his expression change as he registered the burned flesh, the crude B forever marking her skin. His eyes met hers, filled with a righteous anger that should have frightened her but somehow did the opposite. "Never again," he said, the words carrying the weight of a solemn vow. "No one's going to brand you or own you ever again." Grace wanted to believe him. 3 years of captivity had taught her not to trust, but something in this stranger's eyes made her want to hope again. "Can you ride?" he asked, gesturing to his horse. Grace nodded uncertainly. "It's been a while. We need to move. Silverwood's about 5 miles west. I've got a friend there, a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She'll help you." As Kieran helped her onto his horse, Grace felt the warmth of his hands through the thin fabric of her dress. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with gentleness that tears threatened to spill down her dirt-streaked face. "Thank you," she whispered as he mounted behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, his voice low in her ear as he urged the horse forward. "Those men will be back with more guns and more men. This is just the beginning." Grace knew he was right. The Blackwoods wouldn't stop hunting her. But for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't facing them alone. As they rode west toward Silverwood, the vast Montana sky lightened with the first hints of dawn. Grace felt something stir within her that she'd thought long dead, a flicker of hope, fragile but unmistakable. Behind them, the sound of distant hoofbeats carried on the wind. Mrs. Patterson turned out to be a formidable woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her small house on the outskirts of Silverwood was modest but meticulously kept. "So you've brought me another stray, Kieran Dawson," she said, eyeing Grace with an appraising look that took in her torn dress, dirty face, and the haunted look in her eyes. "She needs help, Mrs. Patterson," Kieran said simply. "The Blackwoods are after her." The old woman's expression hardened at the name. "Those devils." She turned to Grace. "Come in, child. Let's get you cleaned up." Inside, Mrs. Patterson drew a bath while Kieran waited outside. The warm water was a luxury Grace hadn't experienced in years, and she wept silently as she scrubbed away the dirt and grime of captivity. The brand on her shoulder stood out angry and red against her clean skin, a permanent reminder of what she'd endured. Afterward, Mrs. Patterson provided a simple but clean dress. "It belonged to my daughter," she explained. "She's in Denver now, married to a banker." "Thank you," Grace said, the words inadequate for the kindness being shown to her. When she emerged from the bedroom, Kieran was seated at the kitchen table, his hat beside him, a cup of coffee in his hands. He stood when she entered, and something in his expression made her cheeks warm. "You look." He began, then cleared his throat. "Better." Mrs. Patterson rolled her eyes. "You never did have a way with words, Kieran. Sit down, both of you. We need to talk about what comes next." Over bowls of hearty stew, Grace told them her story. She'd been traveling west with her father in 1874, hoping to start a new life after her mother's death. Their wagon train had been attacked, not by Indians as she'd first feared, but by the Blackwood brothers and their men. "They killed my father when he tried to protect me," she said, her voice hollow with the memory. "They took me and 2 other women back to their ranch. The others didn't survive the first year." Kieran's knuckles whitened around his spoon. "How many Blackwoods are there?" 3 brothers. "Victor is the oldest, then Mason, and Reed is the youngest. They have about 15 men working for them, most just as cruel as they are." Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and patted Grace's hand. "You're safe here for now, child." Grace shook her head. "No place is safe. They'll find me. They always said they would." "Then we need to stop them," Kieran said firmly. "Permanently?" "How?" Grace asked. "They practically own this territory. The sheriff in River Junction is Victor's cousin." Mrs. Patterson snorted. "Not all lawmen are corrupt. Marshal Williams in Silverwood is as honest as they come, and he's no friend to the Blackwoods." Kieran nodded. "I'll talk to him in the morning. For now, you should rest, Grace. Mrs. Patterson has a spare room." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in years, Grace struggled to sleep despite her exhaustion. Every sound, the creaking of the house, the distant howl of a coyote had her jerking awake, certain the Blackwoods had found her. Near dawn, she gave up and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. She was surprised to find Kieran seated at the table, cleaning his rifle by the light of a single lamp. "You should be sleeping," he said without looking up. "So should you." He glanced up with a half smile. "I'm keeping watch." Grace sat across from him. "Why are you helping me?" "You don't know me." Kieran set down his cloth and rifle. In the lamplight, his face was all planes and shadows, his eyes dark and serious. 3 years ago, my sister disappeared on her way to visit family in Helena. We never found her." His voice was steady, but Grace could hear the pain beneath. "Not a day goes by that I don't wonder if someone could have helped her. If someone should have." "I'm sorry," Grace whispered. "Don't be sorry. Just let me help you. Let me do for you what no one could do for her." Grace studied him, this stranger who had risked his life for her without hesitation. "And after, when the Blackwoods are dealt with, what then?" Kieran's eyes held hers. "That would be up to you. Freedom means making your own choices, Grace. Freedom." The word felt foreign on her tongue, a half-forgotten concept from another life. She'd been property for so long, the idea of choices, her own choices, was almost too much to comprehend. "I don't know if I remember how," she admitted. "You will," Kieran promised. "One day at a time." The sun was rising by the time Marshall Williams arrived at Mrs. Patterson's house. He was a tall man with a bushy mustache and a star pinned to his vest, his eyes shrewd as he listened to Grace's story. "The Blackwoods have been a thorn in my side since I took this badge," he said when she finished. "But kidnapping and slavery, that's federal territory. I can wire the U.S. Marshall and Helena, get some men down here." "How long would that take?" Kieran asked. "A week, maybe more." "She doesn't have a week," Mrs. Patterson interjected. "Those animals could be in town already." The marshal nodded gravely. "I'll post deputies around your house, madam, but my resources are limited." "What about the brand?" Grace asked quietly. "Isn't that proof of what they've done?" Marshall Williams looked uncomfortable. "It's evidence, sure, but without witnesses." He sighed. "The law moves slow out here, Miss Whitley, slower than it should." After he left, Kieran paced the small kitchen. "We can't just wait for the U.S. Marshal. The Blackwoods will have this town torn apart looking for you before help arrives." "What choice do we have?" Grace asked. "We could leave," he suggested. "I have a small ranch about 30 miles north of here. It's isolated, difficult to find if you don't know the way." Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Running won't solve this. Those men need to be brought to justice, not just for Grace, but for all the others they've hurt." Grace touched the brand through the fabric of her borrowed dress. "She's right. I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid." Kieran studied her face. "You sure about this? Staying here is dangerous." "So is living in a world where men like the Blackwoods are free to do as they please," Grace replied, a new determination in her voice. "I want them stopped, whatever it takes." The resolve in her eyes seemed to satisfy him. "Then we'll stop them. Together." That afternoon, word reached Silverwood that riders were approaching from the east, 8 men, led by Victor Blackwood himself. Marshall Williams rushed to Mrs. Patterson's house to warn them. "They're going door to door, claiming they're looking for a runaway servant," he reported grimly. "I've stalled them at the saloon for now, but they'll be making their way through town soon." "Servant," Grace spat the word. "Is that what they're calling it now?" Kieran looked to the marshal. "How many deputies do you have?" 3. "Good men, but we're outnumbered." "Then we need to even the odds," Kieran said. "Grace needs to testify against them, which means keeping her alive and free." Mrs. Patterson, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stood. "I know a place. There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles outside town. My late husband used to work there before the silver ran out. It's abandoned now, but there's a cabin still standing. You could hide there until more help arrives." Grace shook her head. "I'm tired of hiding." "Sometimes," Kieran said gently, "living to fight another day is the bravest thing you can do." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a trust that had formed in the short time they'd known each other. "All right," she agreed reluctantly, "but I want a gun." Marshall Williams raised an eyebrow. "Can you use one? My father taught me, before everything had been taken from her, before the Blackwoods." The marshal nodded and handed her his spare revolver. 6 shots, make them count if you have to." They left as dusk fell, taking Mrs. Patterson's wagon along back roads to avoid being seen. The old mining cabin was little more than a shack, but it had solid walls and a door that locked. More importantly, it offered a clear view of the approach from town. "I'll stay with you," Kieran said as they unloaded supplies. "The marshal will send word when it's safe to return." Grace looked around the small, dusty space. "You don't have to stay, I can manage." "I know you can," Kieran replied, "but you shouldn't have to." That night, they sat by a small fire, careful to keep it low so the smoke wouldn't give away their position. The silence between them was comfortable, each lost in their own thoughts. "Tell me about your ranch," Grace said eventually. Kieran smiled, the firelight playing across his features. "It's nothing fancy. 100 acres, most of it pasture, small herd of cattle, a few horses, cabin I built myself." "Sounds peaceful." "It is," he paused. "It's also lonely sometimes." Grace understood loneliness. Even surrounded by people at the Blackwood ranch, she'd been desperately alone. "Do you have family?" "Not anymore. Parents died when I was young after my sister." He cleared his throat. "It's just me now." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. Kieran looked at her across the fire. "What about you? Before all this, what was your life like?" Grace closed her eyes, trying to remember. "Simple. Happy, I think. My mother died when I was 16. After that, it was just my father and me in our little house in Ohio. He was a school teacher. She smiled at the memory. He had dreams of the West, of open spaces and new beginnings. He used to read stories to me about pioneers and adventures. Is that why you came west? Yes. After Mother died, there was nothing keeping us in Ohio. Father thought we could start fresh here. Her smile faded. We never got the chance. Kieran's hand found hers in the firelight. You'll get that chance now. His touch was warm, solid, anchoring her to the present moment. Grace didn't pull away. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear, a quiet, tentative hope. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Grace insisted on taking her shift, despite Kieran's protests that she needed rest. Standing at the cabin's single window, the revolver heavy in her hand, she watched the moon traverse the star-filled sky and thought about freedom. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Kieran returned from checking the perimeter with fresh rabbit for breakfast. As they ate, Grace noticed him watching her. "What?" she asked. "You're different than I expected," he said. "How so?" He considered his words carefully. "Most people who have been through what you have, they break. Something inside them just gives up." Grace looked down at her hands. "I almost did, many times." She touched her shoulder where the brand lay hidden beneath her clothes. "But every time they hurt me, every time they tried to make me feel like property instead of a person, something inside me refused to surrender. Maybe it was stubborn pride. Maybe it was my father's voice in my head telling me to be strong." "It was courage," Kieran said simply. "The kind most men only dream of having." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a recognition of kindred spirits. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. Kieran was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Get your gun, stay low." From the window, they watched as 8 riders approached the cabin. Victor Blackwood rode at the front, his broad-shouldered frame unmistakable even at a distance. Beside him was his youngest brother, Reed, whose face Grace had learned to fear more than the others. The remaining men were ranch hands, each armed and looking eager for violence. "How did they find us?" Grace whispered, panic rising in her throat. "Someone in town must have talked," Kieran replied grimly. "I count 8 of them and 2 of us, not great odds. What do we do?" Kieran checked his rifle, his expression determined. "We can try to make a run for it out the back, head for the mine entrance. The tunnels might give us cover." Grace shook her head. "They just hunt us down. There's no escape this time." She took a deep breath. "I'm tired of running, Kieran." Their eyes met, and he nodded slowly, understanding what she wasn't saying. "Then we stand and fight, together." Victor Blackwood's voice boomed across the clearing. "We know you're in there, Grace. Come out now, and maybe we'll let your new friend live." Grace felt her heart pounding against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the revolver. She thought of all the women who hadn't survived the Blackwood ranch, of her father dying to protect her, of 3 years of her life stolen. "Get ready," Kieran whispered. "When they come through that door, aim for center mass. Don't hesitate." But before the Blackwoods could make their move, a new sound cut through the morning air, more hoofbeats, coming fast from the direction of Silverwood. Through the window, Grace saw Marshal Williams leading a group of at least a dozen men, all armed and riding hard toward the cabin. Among them was Mrs. Patterson, her silver hair gleaming in the morning sun as she rode astride like a woman half her age. "Looks like the odds just changed," Kieran said, a grin spreading across his face. The Blackwoods turned to face the new threat, clearly surprised by the show of force. Marshal Williams drew his horse to a halt a safe distance away. "Victor Blackwood," he called out. "You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons." Victor's laugh was ugly. "On what charges, Marshal? We're just here to retrieve our property." "People aren't property," the Marshal replied. "Not in this territory, not anywhere in these United States. We've got 3 witnesses who have come forward about what goes on at your ranch: kidnapping, forced labor, murder." He gestured to the men around him. "And these good citizens have decided they've had enough of the Blackwood reign of terror." Grace recognized some of the faces among the posse: the blacksmith, the general store owner, the banker. Ordinary townspeople who had chosen to stand against tyranny. For a moment, no one moved. The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Then Reed Blackwood, always the most impulsive of the brothers, reached for his gun. What followed was chaos. Gunshots echoed across the clearing as both sides opened fire. Grace and Kieran used the cabin for cover, picking their shots carefully. Through the smoke and confusion, Grace saw Victor Blackwood break away from the fight, spurring his horse toward the cabin. Their eyes met through the window, and the hatred in his gaze made her blood run cold. Kieran. She called out in warning as Victor dismounted and charged toward the cabin door. Kieran turned, but too late. Victor crashed through the door, his massive frame filling the small space. He had a knife in his hand and murder in his eyes. "You ungrateful whore," he snarled at Grace. "After everything I gave you." "You gave me nothing but pain," Grace replied, raising her revolver, but Victor was fast for a big man. He knocked the gun from her hand and lunged, the knife slicing through the air where she had been standing a moment before. Grace stumbled backward, looking desperately for a weapon. Kieran tackled Victor from behind, sending both men crashing into the table. The knife clattered to the floor. The two men grappled, each landing heavy blows. Victor's greater size gave him the advantage, and soon he had Kieran pinned, his hands around the rancher's throat. "I'm going to kill you slow," Victor growled. "Then I'm taking what's mine back home where she belongs." Grace's fingers closed around the handle of the fallen knife. Without hesitation, she drove it deep into Victor Blackwood's side. He roared in pain, releasing Kieran to turn on Grace. But the wound was deep, and his movements were slowing. Kieran grabbed his discarded rifle and brought the butt down hard on Victor's head. The big man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Outside, the gunfire had ceased. Grace and Kieran emerged from the cabin to find Marshal Williams and his posse in control of the situation. Reed Blackwood lay dead in the dirt, and the surviving ranch hands had surrendered. Of Victor's middle brother, Mason, there was no sign. He rode off when the fighting started, Mrs. Patterson explained, dismounting with surprising agility for a woman her age. Some of the men went after him. Marshal Williams approached, his hat in his hands. "You two all right?" Kieran nodded, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Victor's inside, alive but wounded." "Good," the marshal said. "I want him to stand trial. I want everyone to hear what he's done." As the marshal's men secured the prisoners, Mrs. Patterson took Grace's hands in hers. "I hope you don't mind that I rallied the town. After you left, more women came forward, wives and daughters who'd had run-ins with the Blackwoods. Once people heard the full story, well." She gestured to the assembled townspeople. "Folks around here may be slow to act, but they know right from wrong." Grace felt tears stinging her eyes. "Thank you." In the days that followed, more of the Blackwoods' crimes came to light. Mason was captured trying to flee the territory and brought back to Silverwood to join his brother in jail. The ranch hands, faced with serious charges, began turning on their former employers, revealing atrocities that shocked even the hardened frontiersmen of Montana territory. Grace testified before a hastily assembled grand jury, showing her brand as evidence of the Blackwoods' cruelty. She wasn't the only one. 3 other women who had escaped the ranch over the years had heard of the arrests and came forward with their own stories. The U.S. Marshal arrived from Helena with federal warrants, ensuring the Blackwoods would face the full weight of the law. The brothers were transferred to Helena to await trial, their empire crumbling in their absence. Through it all, Kieran remained by Grace's side, a steady presence as she confronted her past and began to contemplate her future. 2 weeks after the standoff at the mining cabin, Grace stood on Mrs. Patterson's porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. She heard Kieran's footsteps behind her but didn't turn. "Beautiful evening," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," she glanced at him. "Marshal Williams says the trial date is set, 6 weeks from now in Helena." Kieran nodded. "I'll go with you." Grace smiled, touched by his unwavering support. "You've already done so much, Kieran. You don't have to keep putting your life on hold for me." "Is that what you think I'm doing?" He turned to face her fully. "Grace, meeting you, it wasn't an interruption to my life. It was the beginning of something new." Her heart quickened at his words, at the earnest look in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that when this is all over, when the Blackwoods are behind bars and you're truly free, I hope you'll consider coming to my ranch. Not as someone running or hiding, but as someone choosing. He took her hand gently. I know it's soon, and you have every right to want to make your own way, but Grace silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. Ask me properly, Kieran Dawson. A slow smile spread across his face. He took her hand in his and asked simply, Grace Whitley, when this is all over, would you consider making a life with me? At my ranch or anywhere else you want to go? Grace looked into his eyes that had looked at her with kindness from the first moment, that had seen her as a person worth saving, worth fighting for. Eyes that now looked at her with something deeper, something that made her feel truly seen for the first time in years. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. Yes, I would. Kieran's kiss was gentle, a question rather than a demand. Grace answered by wrapping her arms around his neck, drawing him closer, letting herself feel something she'd thought had been burned out of her forever desire, not born of fear or force, but of genuine affection and growing love. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. I don't know if I remember how to be happy, she confessed. It's been so long. We'll figure it out together, he promised. One day at a time. The trial in Helena lasted 2 weeks. Grace and the other women testified, each sharing their stories of captivity and abuse. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was never in doubt. Victor and Mason Blackwood were sentenced to 20 years in prison for kidnapping, assault, and a host of other charges. As she watched them being led away in chains, Grace felt no satisfaction, only relief. A chapter of her life was ending, the men who had stolen her freedom now losing their own. Outside the courthouse, Kieran waited for her. Ready to go home, he asked. Home, such a simple word, yet it held such power. For 3 years, Grace had known only captivity. Now the world lay open before her, full of choices and possibilities. Yes, she said, taking his offered hand. I'm ready. They were married in Silverwood a month later, with Mrs. Patterson standing proudly as Grace's witness. The town that had rallied to her defense now celebrated her new beginning. The small church filled with people who had risked their lives to stand against tyranny. Grace wore a simple white dress, the high neckline covering the brand that would always mark her skin but no longer defined her spirit. When Kieran saw her walking down the aisle, the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know, that he saw her, all of her, scars and strength alike, and loved what he saw. Their vows were brief but heartfelt, promises not of ownership or obedience but of partnership and respect. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople shook the rafters. The journey to Kieran's ranch, their ranch, now took 2 days. As they crested the final hill and the property came into view, Grace caught her breath. The valley below was verdant with spring grass, a small herd of cattle grazing peacefully near a clear stream. The cabin was larger than she'd imagined, built of solid logs with a wide porch facing the mountains. It's beautiful, she whispered. It needs a woman's touch, Kieran said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. I hope you'll be happy here. Grace looked at him, this man who had saved her in more ways than one. It's not the place that matters, Kieran. It's the freedom to choose it, to choose you. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their home, Grace faced the final hurdle of her healing. Kieran's touch was reverent, patient, nothing like the brutal hands that had used her body as property. When she tensed at a memory, he waited. When tears came, he wiped them away without judgment. We have time, he whispered against her hair. All the time you need. And in that moment, Grace understood that true freedom wasn't just the absence of chains. It was the space to heal, to choose, to love on her own terms. It was Kieran's steady presence beside her, not demanding but offering, always offering. She reached for him in the darkness, guiding his hands to the places that needed to be reclaimed, that needed new memories to overlay the old. And when they moved together, it wasn't about forgetting what had been done to her, but about creating something new and wholly their own. Afterward, as Kieran slept beside her, Grace stood by the window, looking out at the land that was now her home. She touched the brand on her shoulder, feeling the raised scar tissue beneath her fingertips. She would always carry this mark, this reminder of a time when men had tried to own her body and break her spirit. But they had failed. The brand was just a scar now, not a sign of ownership but a testament to survival. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star filled above the ranch, her home, her choice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new joys. There was fencing to mend, cattle to tend, a garden to plant. There was a life to build one day at a time with a man who looked at her and saw not property but a partner. Grace smiled and returned to bed, curling against Kieran's warmth. As she drifted towards sleep, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She was eager for it. 5 years passed, each season bringing new growth and healing to the Dawson ranch. The cattle herd doubled, then tripled as Kieran's careful breeding program paid off. The garden Grace planted that first summer now sprawled across a full acre, producing enough vegetables to sell the surplus in Silverwood every Saturday. The cabin expanded too, with Kieran adding a new bedroom when Grace told him, with joyful tears, that they would need more space. Their son, James, was born on a snowy December night with Mrs. Patterson serving as midwife. 2 years later, their daughter Sarah joined the family, her lusty cries announcing her arrival to the world. On a warm afternoon in late spring of 1882, Grace sat on the porch, watching 3-year-old James chase butterflies while Sarah napped in her cradle nearby. The peaceful scene was one she never could have imagined during her years of captivity, this simple, profound happiness that filled her days. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the familiar sound of Kieran returning from town with supplies. James abandoned his butterflies and ran toward his father, squealing with delight as Kieran scooped him up and settled him on the wagon seat. "Careful with those eggs," Grace called as they approached, noting the precious cargo in the back of the wagon. Kieran winked at her. "We were careful, weren't we, James?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Very careful, Mama." Grace smiled and rose to help unload, but Kieran waved her back. "I've got this. There's a letter for you, though." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. From Helena. Her heart skipped a beat. Helena meant only one thing: news about the Blackwoods. She took the letter with steady hands, though her pulse quickened. The return address confirmed her suspicion: Montana Territorial Prison. Kieran watched her carefully. "Want me to stay while you read it?" Grace shook her head. "No, finish unloading. I'll be fine." As he and James carried supplies inside, Grace opened the letter. It was brief, an official notification that Victor Blackwood had died of pneumonia while serving his sentence. A simple statement of fact, without emotion or elaboration. She stared at the words, expecting to feel something: triumph, perhaps, or at least relief. Instead, she felt oddly empty. Victor Blackwood had once loomed so large in her nightmares, had held such power over her life. Now he was just a name on a piece of paper, a closed chapter. Kieran returned to the porch, concern in his eyes. "Bad news." Grace handed him the letter. "Victor Blackwood is dead." He read it quickly, then looked at her face. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I'd feel something, vindication maybe. But mostly I just feel sorry for him." "Sorry." Kieran raised an eyebrow. Grace touched the spot on her shoulder where the brand lay hidden beneath her dress. Over the years, it had faded from angry red to a pale, silvery mark. He spent his life thinking he could own people, control them. In the end, all he really owned was a prison cell. Kieran sat beside her on the porch step, his solid presence a comfort as always. "You're a better person than he deserved." "Not better," Grace said softly. "Just free, truly free in a way he never was." Kieran took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. After 5 years of marriage, his touch still brought her a sense of safety and belonging that she treasured. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about that day we met. How different our lives might have been if I hadn't decided to take that shortcut to Silverwood." Grace squeezed his hand. "I used to think it was just luck. Now I think perhaps it was something more, like we were meant to find each other." "When I saw you running across that prairie," Kieran said, his voice low with memory, "something in me just knew that whatever happened next, my life was going to change." "Mine too," Grace whispered. "I just didn't know it would change for the better." They sat in companionable silence, watching James play in the yard and listening to Sarah's soft baby snores from her cradle. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the mountains, painting the ranch in golden light. What do you think about adding on another room to the house? Kieran asked suddenly. Maybe turn that storage space into a proper schoolroom for the children, Grace smiled. Education had always been important to her, a value inherited from her schoolteacher father. I'd like that. James is already trying to read every book we own. Like his mother, Kieran teased gently. Grace's voracious reading habits were well known. She'd established a small lending library in Silverwood, bringing books to families who had no access to education. I was thinking, she said hesitantly, that when Sarah's a bit older I might teach at the school in town. Mrs. Miller mentioned they're looking for someone with formal education. Kieran nodded enthusiastically. You'd be wonderful at it. His immediate support warmed her heart. 5 years of marriage had taught her that Kieran meant what he'd said on their wedding day, that her dreams and ambitions were as important as his own, that their partnership was one of equals. I love you, she said simply. Kieran leaned over and kissed her, a tender gesture that still held the passion of their early days. I love you too, always will. That evening, after the children were asleep, Grace took out the small journal she'd kept since coming to the ranch. In it, she recorded not just daily events but her journey of healing the nightmares that gradually became less frequent, the moments when memories ambushed her, the small victories as she reclaimed her body and her life. She wrote about Victor Blackwood's death, examining her feelings with the honesty she'd cultivated over the years. Then she wrote about the schoolroom Kieran wanted to build, about her hopes for teaching in town, about James's precocious reading and Sarah's first wobbly steps. The journal had begun as a way to process her trauma, but it had evolved into something more, a chronicle of a life fully lived, of joy that had seemed impossible during those dark years at the Blackwood ranch. As she wrote the final lines for the day, Grace found herself returning to the memory of that night on the prairie, when a stranger had looked her in the eye and promised, "Never again." How those two simple words had changed everything, had given her permission to hope when hope seemed foolish. Kieran came into the bedroom, his hair damp from washing up for the night. "Writing again?" he asked with a smile. Grace nodded, closing the journal, "Just finishing." He sat beside her on the bed, his weight familiar and comforting. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about us finding each other being more than luck. What about it? I think you're right. I think some things are meant to be, even in this crazy, unpredictable world." He took her hand, tracing the lines on her palm. "Like us." Grace looked at him, this good man who had saved her life, and then, more importantly, had given her the space and support to save herself. In his eyes, she still saw that first promise, unbroken after all these years. Never again would she be owned, never again would she be treated as less than human. "Like us," she agreed, and pulled him close. Later, in the darkness of their bedroom, with Kieran sleeping peacefully beside her, Grace thought about the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. The tragedy that had taken her father, the horrors of the Blackwood ranch, the desperate escape across the prairie, and then Kieran. Not a perfect ending, because life didn't offer perfect endings, but a good one, a life of her choosing with a man who saw her as she truly was and loved what he saw. Children who would grow up knowing only freedom and respect, work that fulfilled her, land that sustained them. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. The sounds of the Montana night, once frightening, now as familiar and comforting as Kieran's breathing beside her. Grace closed her eyes, letting sleep come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. The brand on her shoulder would still be there, a permanent reminder of what she had endured. But it no longer defined her. What defined her now was what she had built from the ashes of that experience, this life, this love, this freedom. Not freedom from, but freedom to. Freedom to choose, to grow, to love. Freedom to be fully and completely herself. As sleep claimed her, Grace's last conscious thought was one of gratitude, not just for her escape from captivity, but for the journey that had followed. For the strength she had found within herself, and for the man who had seen that strength even when she couldn't. Never again, he had promised her that night on the prairie. And he had kept that promise, not by protecting her from the world, but by standing beside her as she faced it on her own terms. Never again would she be branded as property. Never again would she be owned. She was Grace Dawson, now wife, mother, survivor, and above all, a woman who had reclaimed her right to write her own story. And what a beautiful story it was turning out to be. 10 years after Grace's escape from the Blackwood ranch, the Dawson property had transformed into one of the most prosperous in the territory. What had once been a modest operation was now a thriving ranch with 20 hired hands, 300 head of cattle, and a reputation for fair dealing that brought buyers from as far away as Chicago. The cabin had evolved too, expanding into a proper house with 5 bedrooms, a dedicated schoolroom where Grace taught their children and those of their workers, and a library filled with books from all over the country. On a crisp autumn morning in 1887, Grace stood on the front porch, watching the activity in the yard. James, now 10, was helping Kieran repair a wagon wheel, his young face serious with concentration as he handed tools to his father. 8-year-old Sarah sat under the big oak tree, reading to her younger brother Michael, who at 5 was already showing signs of his mother's love for learning. The scene filled Grace with quiet contentment. These moments of ordinary family life still felt like miracles sometimes, precious in their very normalcy. Mrs. Dawson, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Thomas, approached the porch. "Rider coming. Looks like it might be the marshal." Grace shaded her eyes, looking toward the road. Indeed, the figure on horseback wore the distinctive hat and badge of Marshal Williams, though his hair had gone completely gray since she'd last seen him. "Thank you, Thomas. Would you let Mr. Dawson know?" By the time the marshal reached the house, Kieran had joined Grace on the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. The children watched curiously from the yard, sensing the unusual nature of the visit. "Marshal Williams," Kieran greeted him, extending a hand. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Not trouble, I hope." The older man dismounted with a grimace that spoke of aging joints. "No trouble, Mr. Dawson, just some news I thought Mrs. Dawson should hear in person." He turned to Grace with a respectful nod. "Madam," Grace felt a flicker of apprehension. "Please come inside." In the kitchen, Grace poured coffee while the marshal removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. Whatever news he carried clearly weighed on him. "Mason Blackwood is being released," he said finally. "Next week. Good behavior," they said. The coffee pot nearly slipped from Grace's hands. Kieran steadied it, his eyes never leaving her face. "I see," she said, her voice remarkably calm despite the sudden pounding of her heart. "And you think he might come looking for me?" It wasn't a question, but the marshal nodded anyway. "He made some threats during the trial. Said he'd settle scores once he got out." Kieran's expression hardened. "Let him try." Grace set the coffee pot down carefully. "It's been 10 years, Marshal. Surely he's moved on, found other interests." She couldn't bring herself to say victims. Maybe. The marshal didn't sound convinced. "But I thought you should know, just in case. I've notified all my deputies to keep an eye out for him. If he comes anywhere near Silverwood, we'll know." After the marshal left, promising to send word when Blackwood was actually released, Grace stood at the kitchen window, watching her children play in the yard. Their innocent laughter floated through the open window, a stark contrast to the dark thoughts swirling in her mind. Kieran's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head. "We could leave," he said quietly. "Sell the ranch, go east, start over somewhere he'd never find us." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "Is that what you want?" "I want you safe, the children safe." "And if he never comes? If we uproot our lives, leave everything we've built, and he's moved on to Wyoming or Dakota territory, what then?" Kieran sighed. "I don't know, Grace. I just know I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you or the children." Grace touched his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper now than when they'd met, but his gaze still as kind, as steady. "We are not running. This is our home, our life. I won't let Mason Blackwood take that from us, not even the fear of him." "You're sure?" She nodded, more certain with each passing moment. "I've spent 10 years building a life that's mine, ours. I won't give that up because Mason Blackwood might want revenge for crimes he committed." Kieran studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we take precautions. No one rides alone, especially you or the children. We let the hands know to watch for strangers, and we make sure everyone on this ranch is armed and knows how to use a weapon." "Agreed." Grace hesitated, then added, "And we tell James and Sarah something of the truth. Not everything, but enough that they understand the need for caution." That evening after dinner, they sat their older children down in the library while Michael played with wooden blocks nearby, too young to understand the conversation. "A long time ago," Grace began, choosing her words carefully, "before I met your father, there were some bad men who hurt me." James's young face grew serious. "Hurt you how, Mama?" Grace exchanged a glance with Kieran. "They kept me prisoner when I should have been free. They were very cruel." Sarah's eyes widened. "Like in the stories about slaves before the war, something like that," Grace acknowledged. "Your father helped me escape, and later those men were sent to prison for what they did." "Good," James said firmly. "Bad people should go to prison." "Yes, they should," Kieran agreed. "But one of those men is getting out of prison soon, and the marshal thinks he might still be angry." "Angry at you, Mama?" Sarah asked, her voice small. Grace nodded. "That's why we need to be extra careful for a while. No wandering off alone, no talking to strangers. If you see anyone you don't know around the ranch, you come tell me or your father right away." The children nodded solemnly, absorbing the gravity of the situation. James, always protective of his mother and siblings, straightened his shoulders. "I'll help keep watch, Pa," Kieran ruffled his son's hair. "I know you will, James, but remember your job isn't to confront anyone, just to stay alert and stay safe." Later, after the children were in bed, Grace and Kieran sat on the porch, the autumn night cool around them. The ranch was quiet, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the soft hooting of an owl. "You were brave today," Kieran said, taking her hand. Telling the children, Grace sighed. "I've always known this day might come, that the past might catch up to us somehow. We'll face it together, whatever happens." She leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence as she had for 10 years now. "I know we will." The week passed in a strange limbo of tension and normality. Life on the ranch continued. Cattle needed tending. Fences required mending. Children had lessons, but an undercurrent of vigilance ran beneath every activity. The hands, loyal to the Dawsons who treated them fairly and paid them well, took their responsibility seriously. Rifles accompanied every riding party, and eyes scanned the horizon for unfamiliar figures. On the day Mason Blackwood was scheduled for release, Grace found herself unable to concentrate on anything. She moved restlessly from task to task, checking on the children repeatedly, starting at every unusual sound. That night, she stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit ranch while Kieran slept behind her. The land stretched peaceful and silent under the stars, no hint of the danger that might be approaching. Grace touched the brand on her shoulder, a habit she'd never fully broken. The scar tissue was smooth now, the B still legible but faded with time. Like the memories still present, but no longer raw, no longer bleeding, she had not let that brand define her. She would not let Mason Blackwood's release redefine her now. With that resolve firm in her mind, Grace returned to bed, curling against Kieran's warmth, and slept. 2 weeks passed with no sign of Mason Blackwood. Marshal Williams sent word that the former prisoner had indeed been released, but had immediately boarded a train east. According to prison officials, he had spoken of starting fresh in Chicago or New York. Gradually, the heightened vigilance on the Dawson ranch relaxed. The children were allowed to play in the yard again without constant supervision. The hands returned to their normal routines, though they remained more alert than before. Grace began to hope that perhaps Mason had indeed moved on, that the chapter of her life involving the Blackwoods was truly closed. Then, on a market day in Silverwood, everything changed. Grace had gone to town with Sarah and Michael to sell vegetables from their garden and pick up supplies. Kieran and James had stayed behind to work with a new horse they were breaking. The town had grown substantially in the decade since Grace had first arrived there, fleeing for her life. What had once been a small mining settlement was now a proper town with a school, a church, and even a small hotel. The general store, still run by the same family, had expanded to twice its original size. Grace was examining fabric for new winter clothes when she felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as if someone were watching her. She turned slowly, scanning the store. Nothing seemed amiss. Sarah was helping Michael count buttons for a project. The shopkeeper's wife was showing another customer a bolt of wool. The door opened, bringing a gust of autumn air and a man Grace didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with a neatly trimmed beard that didn't quite hide the scar along his jaw. Their eyes met, and Grace knew. Mason Blackwood had changed in 10 years. Prison had aged him, thinned him, hardened the already cruel set of his mouth. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, entitled. Grace instinctively moved to place herself between the newcomer and her children. "Sarah," she said quietly, "take Michael and go to Mrs. Patterson's house. Right now." Something in her voice must have alerted her daughter because Sarah asked no questions. She simply took her little brother's hand and led him quickly toward the back door of the store. Mason watched them go, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Pretty children," he commented, his voice the same drawl Grace remembered from her nightmares. "The girl has your eyes." Grace straightened her shoulders, refusing to show fear. "What do you want, Mason?" He chuckled, removing his hat with mocking courtesy. "Is that any way to greet an old friend, Grace? After all we shared nothing," Grace replied evenly. "You and your brothers took, that's not sharing." His smile faded. "Always had a mouth on you." Victor never did manage to break that spirit. He took a step closer. "Maybe I'll have better luck." The shopkeeper approached, frowning. "Everything all right here, Mrs. Dawson?" "Fine, thank you, Mr. Roberts," Grace said, not taking her eyes off Mason. "This gentleman was just leaving." Mason's laugh held no humor. "Always making friends, aren't you, Grace? That's what got my brothers in trouble. You and your lies." "Your brothers got themselves in trouble by kidnapping women and treating them like property," Grace corrected him. "The only liar here is you, Mason, if you're telling yourself any different." His face darkened with anger. "You think you're so righteous now with your respectable husband and your pretty children, but I remember what you were, what you still are under all that fancy talk." "I know exactly what I am," Grace said calmly. "A survivor, a mother, a free woman." The store had gone silent, the other customers watching the confrontation with wary eyes. Mr. Roberts had moved behind his counter, where Grace knew he kept a shotgun. Mason seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. His eyes darted around the store, noting the hostile stares. "This isn't over," he said quietly, so only Grace could hear. "Not by a long shot." He replaced his hat and backed toward the door. "Give my regards to your husband," he called loudly. "Tell him Mason Blackwood sends his compliments." After he left, Mr. Roberts approached Grace, concern evident in his wrinkled face. "That was one of the Blackwood brothers," Grace nodded, her heart still racing despite her outward calm. "Yes, the middle one, Mason. He was released from prison recently." "I'll send my boy for the marshal," the shopkeeper said. "You should wait here until he comes." "No," Grace decided. "I need to get to my children, make sure they're safe, and then I need to get back to the ranch, warn Kieran." Mr. Roberts nodded. "I'll have Tom saddle your wagon right away. And Mrs. Dawson?" He reached beneath the counter and produced a small revolver. "Take this, just in case." Grace accepted the weapon, its weight familiar in her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson was already comforting the children when Grace arrived at her house. The older woman had aged considerably in the past decade, her once silver hair now snow-white, her back slightly stooped, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Sarah told me a bad man was in the store," she said without preamble. "Blackwood, Mason," Grace confirmed, "just released from prison." Mrs. Patterson's mouth tightened. "That devil, what does he want? Revenge, I think, or perhaps just to frighten me." Grace knelt to embrace her children, who rushed to her side. "Everything's all right," she assured them. "We're going home now." "The bad man from your stories," Sarah whispered. Grace nodded. "Yes, but he can't hurt us. We're going to go straight home to Papa and everything will be fine." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson pressed a small package into Grace's hands. "My late husband's pocket pistol," she explained. "Easier to conceal than that revolver Roberts gave you." Grace stared at her in surprise. "How did you small town, Mrs. Patterson interrupted with a wry smile. "No secrets. Take it. Better to have it and not need it." The drive back to the ranch was tense, Grace constantly scanning the road ahead and behind for any sign of Mason. The children were unnaturally quiet in the back of the wagon, sensing their mother's anxiety. When they finally turned onto the ranch road, Grace nearly wept with relief at the sight of Kieran waiting on the porch, James at his side. They must have been watching for the wagon. As soon as the wagon stopped, Kieran was there, lifting Michael down, gathering Sarah into a hug, his eyes questioning over their heads as he looked at Grace. "Mason Blackwood is in Silverwood," she said simply. Kieran's face hardened. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly." But his intentions were clear enough. Kieran nodded once, his decision made. "James, take your brother and sister inside. Stay there until Mama or I come for you." As the children hurried inside, Kieran turned to Grace. "Tell me everything." She recounted the encounter, trying to remember every word, every nuance. Kieran listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. "He won't set foot on this ranch," he promised when she finished. "I'll make sure of it." Grace touched his arm. "It's not just the ranch I'm worried about. He saw the children, Kieran. He commented on them specifically." The implication hung in the air between them. Mason Blackwood had always been the most cunning of the brothers, the one who planned while Victor bullied and Reed acted on impulse. If he wanted to hurt Grace, he wouldn't necessarily confront her directly. "We'll keep them home from school," Kieran decided. "No trips to town for anyone until this is resolved." "And how will it be resolved?" Grace asked quietly. Kieran had no answer. That night, after a subdued dinner during which the children kept glancing at their parents with worried eyes, Kieran and Grace called a meeting of their most trusted hands. In the bunkhouse, they explained the situation and asked for extra vigilance. "Man threatens the boss's family, he threatens all of us," declared Tom Riley, who had been with them since the beginning. The other men nodded in agreement. "Just keep your eyes open," Kieran instructed. "This isn't your fight. Begging your pardon, mister." "Dawson," said Thomas, the young hand who had first spotted the marshal's approach. "But it seems to me that when a man stands by while good folks are threatened, he's making a choice just the same as if he picked up a gun." Grace was touched by the loyalty these men showed not just to Kieran as their employer, but to her and the children as well. It spoke to the kind of ranch they had built, the kind of community they had fostered. 3 days passed with no sign of Mason Blackwood. Marshal Williams sent word that the man had taken a room at the hotel in Silverwood but otherwise kept to himself, spending most of his time at the saloon. On the 4th day, a package arrived at the ranch, delivered by a boy from town who said a man had paid him to bring it. Inside was a small wooden box. Grace opened it with trembling fingers to find a branding iron, a miniature version of the one that had marked her shoulder, perfectly crafted to fit a child's small body. Kieran's face went white with fury when he saw it. Without a word, he strode to the barn, saddled his horse and rode toward town, his rifle across his saddle. Grace ran after him, catching the reins before he could spur the horse forward. "Kieran, stop. This is what he wants to provoke you, to make you act rashly." "He threatened our children," Kieran said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "No man does that in lives. And if you kill him, what then? Prison, our children growing up without a father." Grace tightened her grip on the reins. "We need to be smarter than him, Kieran. We need to end this without losing everything we've built." Slowly, the blind fury receded from Kieran's eyes. He dismounted, pulling Grace into a fierce embrace. "I can't lose you," he whispered against her hair. "Any of you, you won't," she promised. "We'll find a way to end this, together." That night, after the children were asleep, Grace and Kieran sat at the kitchen table, the miniature branding iron between them like a snake neither wanted to touch. "He's trying to drive us apart," Grace observed. "Make you act impulsively, make me fearful." Kieran nodded grimly. "It's working." "Only if we let it." Grace reached across the table to take his hand. "Kieran, I've been thinking, maybe the answer isn't to hide or to confront him directly." "What then?" Mason has always craved respect, recognition. "It's why he followed Victor's lead all those years. He wanted to be feared the way Victor was feared." Grace leaned forward. "What if we use that against him?" Kieran listened as Grace outlined her plan. It was risky, but it might work, and most importantly, it might end the threat without bloodshed, Without tearing their family apart, the next morning, Grace rode into Silverwood alone, despite Kieran's objections. Two of their most trusted hands followed at a distance, but they would not interfere unless absolutely necessary. Mason Blackwood was at the saloon, as expected. Grace entered without hesitation, ignoring the surprised looks from the patrons unused to seeing a respectable woman in such an establishment. Mason sat at a corner table, a bottle of whiskey before him. He looked up as Grace approached, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Mrs. Dawson," he drawled. "What an unexpected pleasure. May I sit?" Grace asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Mason gestured magnanimously to the chair across from him. "Please, can I offer you a drink?" "No, thank you." Grace sat, her back straight, her eyes never leaving his face. "I came to deliver a message. From your husband. Let me guess he's going to kill me if I come near his family again." Mason chuckled. "Better men than Kieran Dawson have tried." "The message isn't from Kieran," Grace said. "It's from me." Something in her tone caught his attention. Mason leaned forward, curiosity replacing mockery in his expression. "I want you to leave Silverwood," Grace continued. "Today and never return." Mason laughed outright. "And why would I do that?" Grace placed a sealed envelope on the table. "Because if you don't, every newspaper in Montana Territory will receive a copy of this." "And what is this?" "My complete account of what happened at the Blackwood ranch. Every detail, every name, every act of cruelty committed by you and your brothers." Grace held his gaze steadily. "Including the things that weren't brought up at the trial." Mason's smile faded. "No one would believe you." "They believed me enough to send your brothers to prison," Grace reminded him. "And there are other women who escaped before me, women who would corroborate every word." "You're bluffing." Grace shook her head. "I've had 10 years to prepare for this day, Mason. 10 years to gather evidence, to locate other victims, to build a case that would stand even without my testimony." She pushed the envelope toward him. "Rate it, then decide if I'm bluffing." Mason hesitated, then broke the seal and withdrew several pages of Grace's neat handwriting. As he read, his face drained of color. "You can't prove any of this," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "I don't have to prove it in court," Grace pointed out. "Just in the court of public opinion." "How far do you think you'll get in any Western territory once this story is published? How many doors will open for a man known to brand women like cattle?" Mason stared at her, hatred and a grudging respect warring in his eyes. "What do you want?" "I told you. Leave Silverwood. Leave Montana Territory. Never contact me or my family again." "Or what? You'll ruin my reputation," Mason sneered. "I survived prison. I can survive a few newspaper stories." "Can you survive knowing that every person you meet, every potential employer or business partner, will have read a detailed account of your crimes?" Grace leaned forward. "Can you survive being seen not as a dangerous man to be feared, but as a coward who preys on women and children?" That struck home. Mason's face twisted with fury. "You think you're so clever, don't you? The educated schoolteacher's daughter, always thinking you're better than everyone else." "No, Mason, I never thought I was better than anyone." Grace stood, gathering her dignity around her like armor. "I just refused to believe I was less." She turned to leave, but Mason's voice stopped her. "What if I agree to your terms? What guarantee do I have that you won't publish this anyway?" Grace looked back at him. "You have my word, and unlike you, Mason Blackwood, my word means something." She left the saloon with her head high, aware of the stares following her but focused only on the task at hand. Outside, she mounted her horse, her hands steady as she took the reins. The ranch hands who had accompanied her fell in beside her as she rode out of town. "Everything all right, Mrs. Dawson?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Grace said, and was surprised to find it was true. "Everything is fine." When she reached the ranch, Kieran was waiting on the porch, his face tight with worry. "Well," he asked as she dismounted. "He'll leave," Grace said with certainty. "By tomorrow. You're sure?" Grace nodded. "He values his reputation too much to risk it, and he knows I'll follow through if he doesn't comply." That evening, Marshal Williams rode out to confirm that Mason Blackwood had indeed purchased a ticket on the eastbound train, scheduled to depart the following morning. "I'll personally see him aboard," the marshal promised. And I've wired ahead to make sure he doesn't double back at the next station. After he left, Grace and Kieran sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The children played in the yard, their laughter a balm to Grace's soul after days of tension. "You were magnificent today," Kieran said softly, his arm around her shoulders, facing him alone like that. "I wasn't alone," Grace corrected him. "I had you behind me, even if you weren't physically there. I had our life together giving me strength." Kieran kissed the top of her head. "I was terrified I'd lose you." "Never," Grace promised. "What we've built is stronger than Mason Blackwood's hatred, stronger than any threat." As darkness fell, they called the children in for dinner. That night, for the first time in days, the meal was filled with normal family chatter. James's excitement over the new colt in the barn, Sarah's questions about her history lesson, Michael's earnest description of a butterfly he'd seen in the garden. Looking around the table at her family, at Kieran, strong and steady at its head, at James, growing so quickly into a young man with his father's integrity, at Sarah, bright and curious with a natural empathy that made Grace's heart swell with pride. At little Michael, still innocent enough to find wonder in butterflies, Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude. These were the fruits of freedom. This was what she had fought for, what she and Kieran had built together from the ashes of her past. The brand on her shoulder would always be there, a permanent reminder of a time when men had tried to own her body and spirit, but it had no power over her now. It was just a scar, faded with time, its meaning transformed by the life she had chosen to live. Later, as she and Kieran prepared for bed, Grace caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the terrified girl who had run across the prairie 10 years ago. This woman stood straight and proud, her eyes clear, her spirit unbroken. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked, coming to stand behind her. Grace smiled at their reflection, husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. "I'm thinking about that night we met, about what you said to me." "Never again," Kieran remembered, his arms encircling her waist. "You kept that promise," Grace said softly. "Even when I didn't believe it was possible." "We kept it," Kieran corrected her. "Together." Grace turned in his arms to face him. In his eyes, she still saw that first promise, unbroken after all these years. Never again would she be owned, never again would she be branded, never again would she be treated as less than the remarkable woman she was. "Together," she agreed, and sealed the word with a kiss.